Chapter 12, Pivot to Peace. Asian Americans and peace allies mobilize against anti-China aggression. First published on October 22nd, 2022. Washington's most recent anti-China hostility and aggression got a strong counterpunch from Pivot to Peace co-founder, retired San Francisco Judge Julie Tang, and Code Pink on October 18, 2022. The Taiwan Policy Act, which made it out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in September 2022, would recognize Taiwan diplomatically as a de facto nation, not a part of one China, as established by existing treaty law. It would also add $16.5 billion to an already enormous and illegal amount of U.S. military aid to Taiwan. Pivot to Peace and Code Pink are fighting to stop it. Quote, the U.S. is engulfing itself in a war in the Pacific which neither China nor Taiwan want, Tang declared. She cited an October 2022 poll by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs that 60% of U.S. residents agree the U.S. needs to learn to live with China. With the Taiwan Policy Act, Tang said, the U.S. is appointing itself to implement a range of Taiwan's policies, military and civilian aspects, meaning Taiwan is now being colonized again. Taiwan has been part of China for hundreds of years, since the Qing dynasty of the 17th century. Imperial Japan grabbed it as booty in 1895 after defeating China in the Sino-Japanese War. China regained control at the end of World War II. Then the ROC government, under the defeated Kuomintang Party, withdrew to Taiwan, where its leader Chiang Kai-shek ruled until the 1980s. Chiang has always claimed Taiwan as part of China. Quote, a war in the Pacific would have horrendous consequences and would not be easy for the U.S. to win, Tang said. There is so much corruption in a wheeler-dealer fashion in this act. The sponsors were pushing for the interests of Boeing for Taiwan to buy 16 Boeing airplanes. Taiwan couldn't say no. Wang Wulan, leader of the Taiwan Labor Party, said the Taiwan Policy Act is typical hegemonism and imperialism, filling their own pockets. In the name of helping Taiwan, the U.S. wants to make Taiwan a major non-NATO ally, to make it an arsenal at the front of the war theater. The U.S. government is trying to cause regional tension. China's government has been constantly incited to take action, end quote. Two other panel members spoke. Professor Wei Yu of New York's Hunter College, City University of New York, said we're trying to stop a war that has already started in East Asia. Hideki Yoshikawa, a leader of Okinawan efforts to stop construction of U.S. military bases there, said the U.S. is stoking tension between China and Japan, which is trying to intensify militarization of Okinawa. Those bases help form a U.S. noose hanging over China. Code Pink said long before Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. funneled weapons to Ukraine to escalate tension with Russia. Now Congress is about to repeat the same scenario with Taiwan. This act risks further inflaming U.S.-China relations by funneling billions in weapons and military training to Taiwan to prepare for war with China, end quote. In August, retired Judge Julie Tang led a San Francisco rally to protest Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, calling it reckless and unreasonable, with no apparent usefulness or benefit to Americans or the world. Pelosi met with Taiwan leader Tsai Ing-wen, hoping to transfer much of Taiwan's enormous semiconductor industry to the U.S. Pelosi and her husband own a large stake in the U.S. semiconductor industry. In 2017, Tang helped co-found the Comfort Women Justice Coalition that built the Comfort Women Memorial in remembrance of the girls and women sexually enslaved by the Imperial Japanese Army. Retired Judge Tang's leadership in the fight against anti-Asian hate was recently recognized at the Smithsonian National Museum in Washington. Theodore Gonzalez, curator of the Asian Pacific American history at Smithsonian, adopted a banner saying, "Fight the virus, not the people," as part of a 6-month showing at the museum. Retired Judge Julie Tang was the lead organizer who initiated and led the march. In addition to the Asian community, participants included members of Veterans for Peace, Code Pink, ANSWER, which stands for Act Now to Stop War and End Racism, and the Chinese Women Justice Coalition. Part of a global and national movement. Peace rallies are emerging everywhere. Yankees Go Home, U.S.-China Rift Rattles South Korea was the banner headline of the New York Times International section, October 19, 2022. It reported a protest of thousands of South Koreans who fear war between the U.S. and China will impact them. The article quoted a resident of a tiny hamlet 135 miles south of Seoul. "Now, if there is a war, our village will become the first target because of that machine up there." She pointed at the THAAD missile system perched on a hill above the village. THAAD has brought nothing but harm to South Korea, causing economic damage and heightening tensions, said Kang Hyun-wook, another protester quoted in the article. If South Korea sides with one party in the rivalry between the U.S. and China, we could suffer the fate of Ukraine. THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. The U.S. calls it an anti-missile system and says it's deployed against North Korea. The Chinese government considers it an offensive weapon against China and calls for its removal. In Europe, large strikes are surging across the continent. Tens of thousands march in Paris to protest rising living costs, reported the New York Times October 16, 2022. The demonstration occurred on the heels of strikes at oil refineries, adding to a tense political atmosphere, the report said. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, leader of the opposition France Unbowed Party, La France Insoumise, vowed to bring a vote of no confidence against the Macron government over the crisis. In Britain, Prime Minister Liz Truss announced her resignation October 20, 2022, after just 6 weeks in office, following the ouster of Boris Johnson, NATO's principal cheerleader in goading Ukraine to reject peace talks with Russia. The UK foreign minister was forced to resign in mid-October in the wake of widespread strikes against the government's failed economic policies responding to surging inflation. Strong anti-NATO strikes have also hit Italy. Thousands of Germans and Czechs have mobilized against the austerity forced on them by Western sanctions against Russian gas, oil, and wheat. Pivot to Peace was formed in response to the so-called Pivot to Asia, announced in 2011, which has developed into a pivot toward war and confrontation. Pivot to Peace insists that the government and mass media turn away from the anti-China Cold War. Its goal is to educate and mobilize public opinion about the benefits of a policy that facilitates cooperation and mutual respect between the United States and China. Pivot to Peace is a coalition including military veterans, public sector workers, professors, healthcare professionals, public officials, legal professionals, and others who are concerned about the future of relations between the U.S. and China. In its mission statement, Pivot to Peace says we reject the escalation towards global conflict and instead urge peace and cooperation with China. We believe in the fair and open communication of information about China, its economic, social, and political affairs, free of the biases and distortions which dominate much of mainstream media in the United States. We support the frank exchange of views based on facts and evidence, rather than fear-mongering and the revival of old racist stereotypes and Cold War political bugbears. We want to build support for peace and prosperity and a shared future of mutually beneficial development for both the American and Chinese people. We believe that friendship and engagement between our countries is the better path towards that future. In the United States, protests took place in dozens of cities during the week of October 15th to 22nd, 2022. The actions targeted U.S. aggression against China, Cuba, Iraq, Russia, Somalia, and Syria, from Venezuela to Palestine to North Korea. Any U.S. action against any country attempting to stay independent of the U.S. A Minneapolis Anti-War Committee speaker, Autumn Lake, denounced the decades-long effort led by the United States to isolate and undermine the People's Republic of China. She said the U.S. has long spread anti-Chinese propaganda, accusing the People's Republic of human rights violations, of suppressing right-wing pro-democracy protests, and even outright genocide. She said accusations of genocide of ethnic minority Uyghur Muslims in China, spread by the U.S. government and corporate media propaganda machine, are part of a long-term project of manufacturing consent for a humanitarian intervention in China. Mike Madden of Minneapolis Veterans for Peace and the Assange Defense Committee spoke of the history of NATO intervention in Ukraine and the rest of Eastern Europe. He said it's critical for anti-imperialists to fight back against U.S. efforts to escalate the war in Ukraine and lead the world into another world war. Perhaps the most common adjective used to describe the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been unprovoked, Madden said. In fact, it was deliberately provoked. The Bronx Anti-War Coalition organized a demonstration in the heart of the South Bronx in New York City. The rally on Fordham Plaza centered local community leaders speaking from La Peña del Bronx, TBS New Direction, and United We Stand, United We Stronger, who proclaimed, "Where's the $60 billion plus for the Bronx?" A wide range of groups were involved in these protests. In Minnesota, it was Anti-War Advocates of Minnesota, the Anti-War Committee, Bikers Riding Against Police Brutality, the Climate Justice Committee, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee, Minnesota War Tax Resistance, Minnesota Workers United, Movement for a People's Democracy, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, Socialist Action, Socialist Party USA, St. Paul East Side Neighbors for Peace, Twin Cities Assange Defense, Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar Clark, Twin Cities CP USA, Twin Cities Nonviolent, Veterans for Peace, Welfare Rights Committee, and Women Against Military Madness. In the Bronx, speakers were from Black Alliance for Peace, Amazon Labor Union, A Call to Action on Puerto Rico Not for Sale, Cuba Sea Coalition, Bronx Green Party, Haiti Liberté, People's Power Assembly, Struggle La Lucha, United National Anti-War Coalition, Workers' World Party, and Workers' Assembly Against Racism. Up to now, the war makers in Washington have been virtually unanimous in calling for more war. Their sponsors in the military-industrial complex and the energy companies, together with their stenographers in the mainstream media, have made it all too easy to stick together for war. But the fissures in their NATO coalition in Europe and the surging anti-war sentiment across Europe, Asia, and the U.S. suggest the unanimity will not last.